All right, everyone, we are going to start. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends of ICCT, I'm very pleased to welcome you all here at ICCT in The Hague or online for the second day of our annual conference. Yesterday, we had a very interesting conversation exploring some potential consequences of the growing rivalry among great powers on counterterrorism policy. We reflected notably on the strategic competition with China and Russia in certain geographical regions or within the multilateral system. Today, we want to explore a little more what the implications of the new geopolitical landscape could be for human rights and rule of law compliant counterterrorism agenda. We have a very interesting panel discussion coming up with Rashmi Singh, Tom Parker, and Helen Duffy. Just before the panel discussion, we will also have a brief demo of the Frank Terrorist Fighters Knowledge Hub, a new database that was developed jointly by ICCT and the Asser Institute, which will be done by Sophie Bowman. But first, we have the privilege to welcome Ilke Salmi as our keynote speaker to share his thoughts and insights on the general theme of this conference, global power politics, counterterrorism, and human rights. Ilke Salmi is the EU counterterrorism coordinator since October last year. In that capacity, he is responsible for coordinating the EU's counterterrorism policy within Europe, but also outside Europe, and to ensure that the EU plays an active role in the fight against terrorism. Mr. Salmi has a stellar career between Brussels and Helsinki. At the European level, he was previously director of the European Commission's Disaster Preparedness and Prevention Directorate and director of the EU Intelligence and Situation Center. That's in that capacity that I met you for the first time, actually. In Finland, Mr. Salmi has been permanent secretary of the Ministry of Interior, a position that wasn't permanent after all, apparently, and director of the Finnish Security Intelligence Service. After Mr. Salmi's speech, if time allows, we will be able to take a couple of questions. People online can share questions via the Q&A function in Zoom, and there will be someone here to ask those questions out loud to the speakers. If you're tweeting, please remember to use the conference hashtag, which should be showing on your screen. Without further ado, Mr. Salmi, Ilka, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's really my pleasure to be here, and apologies for my voice. I have an old-fashioned flu. This is nothing to do with COVID, but I hope that it carries out through my 20 or so minutes of briefing you how I see the world. But first of all, allow me to thank Mr. Renat Thomas for inviting me for this conference today. I find it very valuable that I have this opportunity to share some of my thoughts, and I think that traditionally we have seen this as a very valuable cooperation between my office and of course the academia and the policymakers which the ICCT brings together. So great to be here. In my remarks today, I will first touch upon the geopolitical situation and the EU's strategic compass, which also guides our response to geopolitical threats, including terrorism. I will then cover my external and internal priorities in the context of global power politics and human rights, the theme actually of today's conference. I will also explain how my concerns are linked to the human rights and the rule of law, which should guide all our CT efforts externally and internally. I also observe with a great concern how human rights and the rule of law are under threat outside the EU. Within the EU, on the other hand, we risk curtailing our law enforcement and security so much that we create a system that is unworkable for them. This could benefit organized criminals and terrorists who undermine our citizens' security and thereby the most basic preconditions for their enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. But I kick off with the geopolitical context. The human rights, the rule of law, and the rules-based international order have always been at the core of the EU's counterterrorism policy. This will not change. As a democratic society, we have no choice because our entire governing system is constructed around these core values. Our rule of law-based counterterrorism policy also stems from the astute understanding of our long-term interests. A global system characterized by rivalry between great powers without any rules constraining them cannot be stable. Instability, in turn, gives rise to terrorism. Fighting terrorism without much regard for human rights might bring apparent short-term gains, but it is certainly counterproductive in the long term. More than before, the European Union is facing raw power politics from non-democratic states. Russia and China openly strive for a multipolar world in which a limited number of great powers rule, each with its own sphere of influence, a drawback to the era before the world wars. There is a fierce battle of narratives driven by different governing systems. This was already happening before the war in Ukraine, but it is now more out in the open and rapidly accelerating. Authoritarian states are also ever bolder in their exploitation of the counterterrorism for political purposes. In the decade after the 9/11, the EU worked with partners across the globe, albeit in a transnational way, to develop the UN framework and the international counterterrorism instruments, such as the FATF, for cross-border counterterrorism cooperation. However, as a result of the increased global great power competition, the global consensus on countering terrorism, which was always delicate and never comprehensive, is currently even more fragile than before. While we will continue to pursue and promote multilateralism, scope for progress is obviously much more limited now. In some areas, including the UN framework for the protection of human rights while countering terrorism, we need to pull out all the stops to prevent important achievements from being reversed. Furthermore, terrorism is increasingly connected to other global challenges. The EU is surrounded by instability. It now faces a war in Ukraine, right across its eastern border. European security is threatened by terrorism and organized crime, hybrid conflicts and cyber attacks, the progressive weakening of the arms control architecture, and the instrumentalization of irregular migration. Financial instability as well as social and economic divergences have a growing impact on our security. Disinformation, hate speech, foreign influence, and radicalization are increasingly linked. The EU's strategic compass explains the EU's strategy in this changing world. The compass aims at strengthening the EU as a more capable actor and reliable partner in security and defense. It anchors counterterrorism in a comprehensive joint-up strategy that deals with a gamut of security challenges that we are facing. While the compass is clear-eyed about challenges from the authoritarian states, it does not give up on the multilateralism. On the contrary, it outlines how we should step up efforts to defend the rules-based international order. It also calls for an expansion of the network of around 20 counterterrorism experts in the EU representations across the world, just to point out a specific issue. The strategic compass states that the EU will continue to support partner countries in the area of counterterrorism through stabilization efforts and programs for preventing radicalization. It outlines how the EU will pursue a tailored and integrated approach to capacity building. This includes training and equipping the security forces of our partners. We link such assistance with security sector reform aimed at good governance and respect for human rights. The EU has engagement of about 500 million euros dedicated to preventing and countering violent extremism in third countries. In this context, the compass acknowledges the need for evaluation of the way in which the EU translates its CT policies into projects. In addition, given the challenging international environment, the strategic compass states that the EU will step up CT engagement with strategic partners, including the UN and in multilateral fora. In line with these objectives, the EU has just taken on the co-chairmanship of the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum, the GCTF, an informal global platform of countries cooperating in counterterrorism. The GCTF translates broad counterterrorism policies, UN Security Council resolutions, and new challenges into hands-on guidelines for governments. After this very general outline on EU counterterrorism policy in the volatile world, let me discuss with few words on some of my own external priorities. First of all, the fight against the spread of Islamist extremist ideology. Secondly, improving humanitarian conditions and fighting radicalization in the camps and prisons in northeast Syria. Thirdly, addressing the deteriorating situation in the Sahel. And fourthly, countering the risk of a spillover of terrorism from Afghanistan. In the regions closest to Europe, the near Middle East, the most of Africa, the global power competition leads to growing instability. Such conditions are breeding ground for groups such as Al-Qaeda and Daesh. Both Daesh and Al-Qaeda remain strong even after facing major setbacks, such as Daesh's loss of its territorial strongholds in Syria and Iraq, and the killing of Daesh and Al-Qaeda leaders. They retain many affiliates around the world, and we need to prevent the establishment of new terrorist sanctuaries where attacks can be prepared. In many countries, Islamist extremist ideology from the Gulf has prepared a receptive audience for their messages. Decades of promotion and financing of Islamist extremism have led to radicalized ecosystem in Europe and across the world. In that respect, I have started a constructive dialogue with Saudi Arabia aimed at halting the dissemination of such material in the EU. I wish to start a similar dialogue on the extremist materials and financing with other Gulf states as well. In the future, it would be important to cover also the situation of the spread of materials and financing in the Western Balkans and the Sahel. The camps and prisons in northeast Syria in which family members of Daesh fighters are held are a ticking time bomb for Europe's security. A majority of the nearly 60,000 residents in the camps are children who grow up in miserable conditions and are exposed to violent extremism every day. Daesh will seek to recruit them as fighters as they grow up. In the camps, half of the residents are Iraqis and a third are Syrians. There are also, of course, EU citizens in these camps as well. The possible repatriation of the Europeans in the camps is a matter for the member states rather than the EU. But as you know, a number of member states have repatriated mothers and their children, as did the Netherlands only last week. Decongestion of the camps is essential to improve humanitarian conditions and reduce radicalization. Presently, the EU is exploring how to step up support for Iraqi efforts to repatriate Iraqi families from Al-Hol, namely the biggest camp, and to assist the reintegration of Syrians into their local communities. As half of the population in Al-Hol is Iraqi, as I mentioned, it's a top priority to support Iraq. This would considerably decongest the camps. Those who committed crimes should be put on trial when they return. For this, use of evidence collected on the battlefield is indispensable. With EU support, the UN, more specifically UNITAD, is working with Iraqi authorities to make available battlefield information for investigations and prosecutions in the EU and elsewhere. Afghanistan remains a serious cause for concern to me. The Taliban took power by force, but promised an inclusive government. Instead, they transformed the country into a theocratic dictatorship. They promise to respect women's rights, but are oppressing women in education, freedom of movement, dress code, etc. They promise to deny terrorists bases on Afghan soil from where they could plot against the West. But the US found an AQ leader, al-Zawahiri, in a house in the center of Kabul. AQ and South and Central Asian terrorist groups remain present in Afghanistan. Nor has the Taliban been able to suppress the local Daesh branch, which continues to attack members of religious minorities. Afghanistan could remain a platform for terrorist networking and training. We need to monitor developments in the country closely in cooperation with regional and partner countries. The UN is an important source of information and of delivery of humanitarian aid to the Afghan people. Europe has an interest in preventing a new major wave of emigration with all the dangers it would entail for infiltration by terrorists. A serious new concern is the impact of the war in Ukraine on the terrorist threat in the EU. To date, the war's repercussions have remained limited, but the consequences in the longer term could be significant. While Russia tries to justify its aggression with references to denazification, it has long spread right-wing extremist propaganda and disinformation in order to sow discord and division in Europe. Currently, Russian propaganda tries to blame NATO and the EU for the war and its repercussions. Violent right-wing extremists and violent anti-system extremists appear to be particularly receptive to conspiracy narratives of Russian origin. I'm also concerned about the possibility that arms circulating in Ukraine could be used by terrorists in the future. And please do not misunderstand me. It is necessary for the EU and its member states to provide arms to Ukraine to defend itself. The very worst outcome for the EU would be if Russia reaches its military objectives. That goes without saying. Yet, when providing security support to Ukraine, we should do so without overlooking future risks of criminal networks smuggling firearms and other weaponry into the EU. The experience after the war in Bosnia in the 1990s show these firearms could end up in the future in the hands of terrorists and organized crime. If we do not act soon, then firearms could end up in the wrong hands, so scope for action will be extremely restricted if we wait. The EU has already taken important steps to help Ukraine in the area of border security. An EU border assistance mission to Moldova and Ukraine helps these countries' border guard and customs agencies. In addition, since the start of all-out war in February, Europol and European Border and Coast Guard Agency Frontex have deployed dedicated staff to member states bordering Ukraine and to Moldova to assist in border security. Then, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to turn to the terrorist threat in the EU. I would say that the threat that we are currently facing in the EU remains high, even though the number of attacks has diminished compared to the period between 2014 and 2018. In most EU member states, Islamist extremist ideology remains the main driver of the threat. The risk of sophisticated, spectacular attacks, such as simultaneous shootings and bombings in Paris in November 2015, centrally organized by Daesh or Al-Qaeda, is now clearly lower than it was in the previous decade, partly as a result of the disappearance of Daesh's territorial stronghold in Syria and Iraq. However, Islamist terrorist organizations continue to inspire lone actors who then carry out low sophistication attacks. In addition, instances of alleged blasphemy elicit virulent reactions online independent of Daesh or AQ's propaganda. These reactions, in turn, inspire Islamist lone actors to stage attacks in revenge. Foreign influencing and financing have contributed to the expansion of Islamist extremist ideology in Europe, creating Islamist echo chambers that incite vulnerable young people to commit violent acts. Prison leavers pose a particular risk. Many Islamist terrorist prison inmates, including those returning from Syria and Iraq, merely served relatively short sentences for membership of a terrorist groups because insufficient evidence was available to prove more serious offenses. As a result, many convicts are already being released. Without proper monitoring, reintegration, and rehabilitation, their release might increase the terrorist threat. Radicalization in prison among the non-terrorist convicts is an additional risk factor. At the same time, large parts of the EU are confronted with a growing threat of violent right-wing extremism and terrorism. For example, on the October 12th, a 19-year-old gunman shot 2 individuals dead outside an LGBT venue in Bratislava. He killed himself and left a neo-Nazi anti-Semitic manifesto mentioning his inspiration from earlier right-wing attacks and from right-wing online social media. It is a trend in several EU member states that younger males are drawn into the right-wing extremist universe. Law enforcement and domestic intelligence services continue to foil attacks motivated by violent right-wing extremism, and the volume of hate speech and incitement to violence on right-wing extremist social media has increased. I'm also concerned about the potential for violence among radicalized individuals harboring strong anti-system views. Many Western democracies face an increase in anti-establishment sentiments expressed on internet and in large-scale anti-government protests, for instance in the context of government measures to contain the spread of COVID. To various degrees, conspiracy beliefs drive anti-system views. These beliefs are in turn bolstered by disinformation spread by foreign powers. Online echo chambers brought about by the algorithms of social media networks contribute to the spread of conspiracy narratives that buttress violent anti-system propaganda. In addition, violent anti-system extremists communicate on social media networks with little or no content moderation, as well as decentralized platforms and the dark web. While adherents of the anti-system trend clearly state what they oppose, their ultimate objectives often remain very vague. This lack of clear vision makes their protests prone to appropriation attempts by long-established violent extremist groups. Violent right-wing and left-wing extremist organizations frequently fuel anti-system grievances and latch onto anti-system protests. While most of these protests have remained peaceful, a number of violent incidents, including plots to murder or kidnap high-ranking officials, are reason to take violent anti-system extremism seriously as a threat to our security. The EU is currently debating this potential terrorist threat and the possible need for joint action to address it. So what do we do then to counter the EU's internal threats? Our domestic efforts to fight terrorism have been increasingly successful. While the threat of terrorism remains present, the risk of major attacks has decreased in recent years. Growing resilience, as demonstrated by a number of plots that have been disrupted, has contributed to this positive trend. I will highlight some of the examples of what we are doing, but this is not an exhaustive overview, of course. Prevention is by far the best way to combat terrorism. The Radicalization Awareness Network, RAN, allows practitioners and policymakers to exchange best practices on prevention of radicalization, disengagement, and rehabilitation programs. The EU Internet Forum provides a collaborative environment for EU governments and major digital companies to reduce accessibility to terrorist content and increase effective counter-narratives online. The EU is also financing projects in the areas such as education, sports, and culture to provide opportunities to disadvantaged and at-risk youth. As regards the investigation and prosecution of acts of terrorism, the EU has contributed to member states' efforts by adopting common minimum legislation on topics such as terrorist crimes, financing of terrorism, firearms, border security, and explosive precursors. The EU has also strengthened the agencies Europol and Eurojust, which today support member states in all major CT investigations and prosecutions. Police and judicial cooperation has been upgraded based on the principle of mutual recognition, which is much faster and stronger than traditional mutual legal assistance. The EU has stepped up security research and technological innovation. Again, the EU has invested in the establishment and improvement of feeding and the use of different databases related to security, justice, borders, and migration. Interoperability of the main database is a crucial objective in the site in the near future. Cooperation among the member states' security and intelligence services, which takes place outside the EU, has increased over the years. Turning to the online dimension, the EU has adopted a regulation which obliges online platforms to take down terrorist content within 1 hour after being notified by a competent authority. In addition, the Digital Services Act, adopted in October this year, will require very large platforms offering services in the EU to carry out audits and mitigation of systemic risks, like amplification of extremist and divisive content by their algorithms at the expense of other content. Unfortunately, the principle of non-liability of platforms for the content they host and the absence of a general content monitoring obligation remain, exactly like in the US. Therefore, it is essential that we maintain a dialogue with the big and small platforms for better content moderation. Concluding my talk here today, I would like to share my concern about the developments that risk undermining law enforcement and intelligence services' ability to investigate and prevent acts of terrorism. In fact, the services are dangerously close to losing crucial means of investigation that they have had for decades. Example and very concrete examples are the data retention and end-to-end encryption. The replacement of traditional telecommunication with online communication, which is often end-to-end encrypted, is making lawful interception highly challenging for law enforcement and intelligence services, even if they would present a properly motivated legal warrant. If non-traditional telecommunications are not regulated in the way to offer the services the possibility of lawful access, then they will have to rely increasingly on metadata only. However, rulings of the European Court of Justice over the last 5 years have also limited national authorities' possibility to require telecom providers to retain metadata. So there is a real risk that law enforcement and intelligence services go blind. I sincerely hope that the new e-privacy regulation will safeguard many of the services' capacities to investigate and prevent acts of serious crime and terrorism. For this, however, it is essential that security practitioners explain to the public and to the EU legislators what the risks are if they lose these rights. The EU risks striking a balance between privacy and security that could prove to be unworkable for intelligence and law enforcement services who protect us from crime and terrorism. The intentions are to protect fundamental freedoms, but terrorists and organized criminals inevitably benefit from these constraints. Terrorism and organized crime undermine citizen security and could, as a result, threaten the functioning of our democracy itself. Fundamental rights, in my view, are meaningless if the state does not have the means to provide security. The right to privacy and data protection is not absolute. Other fundamental rights, like the right to physical integrity and the right to life, also needs to be protected. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilkka, for a fascinating speech, fascinating discussion. We have now a little bit of time for maybe a couple questions from here in the audience, or potentially people online. Alex will be monitoring the Q&A in Zoom. So for those of you who have a question, please raise your hand. A microphone will magically come to you. And if you have a question, just simply introduce yourself so that Mr. Sami knows who is asking the question. Don't be shy, obviously. Alex, do we have some questions online? Or Suzanne, yeah. I think you might have to push the red button.
Hello. Yeah. Hello, Susanna Conrad, policy analyst on rule of law and security in sub-Saharan Africa from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Thank you very much for the broad overview about what you're doing and your team. I have a concrete question to the European Peace Facility, because you've been talking about that the European Union is willing to train security forces and also to equip the security forces. And the European Union can do this with the European Peace Facility as an instrument. So the European Union did this with regard to the Ukraine, so to the eastern neighborhood, but I guess they did it not with regard to the southern neighborhood, so to the African continent. There are some African nations asking for support by trainers and also arms by the European Union. But this doesn't happen so far yet. So my question is, why? Why nothing happened to the African countries based on the European Peace Facility?
Thank you for a very pertinent question. If I reply very quickly, I mean, first of all, what we are trying to do now, and I did not speak about Africa or Sahel here, which is very high on my agenda. I think it would have kind of deserved another 25 minutes to discuss that topic only. But actually, one of the components that we are now looking into is to have a more, let's say, non-kinetic, more civilian approach to countering terrorism in Africa, and especially in some of the Sahel region or the coastal states. And in order to do that, we are also now exploring as a comprehensive approach into this region. And I think that your very, as I said, a very pertinent question will come up into these discussions that what would be the best way forward. So the External Action Service, of course, and my office, I personally have been involved trying to address the African countries in order to understand what are the needs and how would we also bring in, especially from the CT point of view, let's say the European approach into this question, also convincing them that the countering terrorism is not only a kinetic or a kind of a military approach, but we have to have a more wider question. Why it hasn't taken place so far the same way as with Ukraine, that I don't actually know. But I hope that if we would have this conference 1 year's time from now, hopefully we would be much wiser, because actually the progress is, lots of progress is taking place as we speak vis-a-vis Africa and Sahel. Did not really answer your question, but I mean the issue is really that we are looking very closely how we could be more efficient in that specific field.
Because I know that Mr. Salmi's time is counted. He has to go back to Brussels after this. We can take a couple more questions. I see Bibi and Noreen. We can group them together, and then Ilke can answer, and then we will close the session.
Thank you. Thank you, Ilka, for your presentation. We had a very interesting discussion yesterday talking about global power politics and the fact that, for instance, in fora like the United Nations, everything is a little bit in a deadlock due to the situation in Ukraine, the position of Russia, the big stake they have in all the dealings within the UN. And we were looking for ways forward, some of the positive out of this. Now, one of the suggestions that was considered is whether there is a role for the EU to step up and take over a more prominent role on the global forum, on the global international forum, more in general, to play a more prominent role to move the agenda forward. So maybe you can reflect on that.
Thanks for that presentation, Ilka. Great to hear all the points you laid out. My question's on Ukraine. You mentioned the potential future risks, and I know that it's definitely not the same context as the last few waves of foreign fighters that we've seen, but knowing that the context is complex and likely to change and that there are these potential risks, are there steps that the EU can take now to maybe think about, if they're returnees who are traumatized, angry, radicalized, or how to deal with the potential for weapons coming back? So just, are there preparatory steps being taken at this time? Thank you.
Excellent. I try to address both questions or both comments very quickly. On the global forum and the UN aspect, first of all, I do believe that actually the fact that EU will be now co-chairing the GCTF is actually a signal that we want to take a more prominent role as the EU. This is, of course, the External Action Service colleagues who are running the show. My office and we will, of course, contribute to their work content-wise, but I do feel that this is a very clear, concrete signal that we want to play this role in this very difficult environment. As you pointed out, we have aspects especially in the UN framework where we would need to, as I was saying earlier on, that we need to push things forward, and hopefully we could do that at least partially through the GCTF, and then again, if I see that from a very practical point of view, the cooperation between the different UN entities, BNT, UNOCT, or the others, and my team are actually just at the high level as they always used to be. So at least we compare the notes with them as well. So let's hope that would have even a slightly positive impact in that we won't get stuck. And I'm absolutely convinced that the colleagues in the EAS are very, very, let's say, enthusiastic and also quite, interested in making some progress. So it's but as you said, it's a difficult situation where we are. I think when the campaign for the GCTF co-chair started, I don't think that anyone imagined that we would be in a situation where we are today. On the Ukraine, on the concrete measures, actually there are lots of things that take place as we speak. We did pay a visit. There was some kind of a Team Europe visit to Kiev 5 weeks ago, led by me with the Commission and the External Action Service on board, as well as the Frontex and Europol, to discuss very concretely what could we do about tracing the arms and what have you, the border security related issues, and then of course the question of what we call the foreign volunteers traveling to Ukraine and coming back from the EU member states. One of the things that we all face, if we discuss the foreign volunteers, first of all, that in some member states it's a criminal act to travel, while in some others it's not. So it's very difficult for the governments of the member states to really know who has traveled, who has come back, and what have you. So of course we would like to exchange more information with the Ukrainians on this issue. Then again, on a concrete measures, I know that what is already now cooking is a possibility to do and what they call the status agreement between Ukraine and Frontex, so that they could also play a more significant role in the border security related issues. That's mainly on the western border of Ukraine, of course. And then a concrete issue with Europol, cooperation with the Ukrainian authorities, law enforcement authorities and Europol, which already exists, and there is a good cooperation. There's a liaison officer in The Hague here from Ukraine, and hopefully now they will appoint another one, so that the information exchange would be even more lively and more information would be shared in the future. So and also the Commission is also looking into a possibility to come up with, and I think they call it an action plan for small arms and light weapons, as far as Ukraine is concerned. So actually there are indeed many measures that are already now put in place in order to let's say prepare for the future, for the medium long-term aspects of this war.
Thank you very much. Ilkka, please everyone join me in a round of applause to thank Ilkka Sami. And I'd like now to invite Sophie for presenting the Foreign Terrorist Fighters Knowledge Hub.
Is this working? It is, isn't it? Okay, cool. I'm going to test this as well, if this is working too. Yeah. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Zsófia Bowman. I'm a former researcher at the TMC Azar Institute, and I'm going to present you the Foreign Terrorist Fighters Knowledge Hub. As it was previously mentioned by Thomas, this was a joint project between the Azar Institute and ICCT. We've been working on this for 2 years. And it's going to go live, it's expected to go live in the upcoming days. So at this point, I'm going to present you a sneak peek of this website. As Alex briefly mentioned it yesterday, or talked about it yesterday, our aim with this Knowledge Hub was to create a go-to place for all things foreign terrorist fighters related. So we wanted to have a hub of information, but not just of data and trends, but also a hub of information for policies that have been implemented as a response to FTFs, a hub for relevant legislation, the legal framework for FTFs, and also a hub that serves as a library for relevant publications on foreign terrorist fighters. So what you can see on the slide now is the homepage of the Knowledge Hub. As you can see, it currently contains information on 30 countries. But we designed it in a way that it's easily expandable, and we can easily add countries later on. It also allows for adding new conflicts if there is a demand on the long run. So currently it focuses on 30 countries and exclusively on foreign terrorist fighters who have gone to and returned from Iraq and Syria. So on the homepage, you see the 30 countries flags, and if you click on these flags, it will navigate you to specific country-specific home pages. So what you can see there is the country page of the Netherlands. So all the country pages are structured in a similar way. They all contain information on data, so quantitative data on the main trends for that given country, measures, so the measures that have been implemented as a response to foreign fighters, and a small section of additional resources, which is further readings that are connected to that country. So you can see it's the country page of the Netherlands. I'm actually going to show you more infographics. So the data that we collected was done via open source data collection. We looked at the main trends. We looked for numbers of how many people went to Iraq and Syria, the composition of the people who went, age, marital status, sex, the people who returned, the response to returns, who have been prosecuted, who haven't, and so forth, so on and so forth. These are presented in infographics on the country pages. Underneath, as I mentioned, there is a section that contains the main measures implemented. So on the homepage or in the country page of the Netherlands, you see 4 different types of measures: preventive, administrative, criminal and surveillance, and rehab and reintegration. So what we wanted to do here is provide you a short overview or a brief overview of what the Netherlands has done with regards to these measures as a response to foreign terrorist fighters. As I said, at the bottom of each country page, there is a further section that gathers relevant publications. So here, for example, you'll see some more articles on Dutch foreign fighters. As I mentioned previously, our data collection was based on open source research. So that means that there are some information missing. So there are differences between how much information was available for certain countries. So here you can see, this is, I think, the country page of the United States. There are some gaps in it where we couldn't find information. This is included on the hub on purpose. It serves as an invitation for governments or researchers working on this topic to submit information if they have data that we're missing or if they have newer, more recent data. To this end, we also included a questionnaire on the Knowledge Hub. This questionnaire is a downloadable document. It can be downloaded by anyone. It kind of follows the structure of the country page, so it asks the same information, quantitative data and qualitative data, asking about the measures implemented in a given country. And if there are governments who think that the data we presented is not enough, or they have something more recent, they can fill out this questionnaire and submit it to us. And the researchers at ASER and ICCT will review that information and decide whether to include it or not. Another, I think, interesting and super relevant tool or feature of the Knowledge Hub is the policy matrix. So as you can see, this brings back the 4 measures that you saw on the country pages, but it also expands on these measures, and it provides definitions of what these are. It provides examples of what we mean by administrative measures, what different types of criminal measures there are that have been implemented. And it also gives good practices from relevant global counterterrorism forum documents. So if you click on one of these, for example, if you click on the rehabilitation and reintegration measures, you will see this. Here it expands on what these are. So it gives you a definition of what rehab and reintegration means. It also gives you some examples, what type of different rehab programs. There are government-led, there are ad hoc initiatives, there are local, state level, civil society-led, so on and so forth. It gives you definitions for those as well. And unfortunately, it doesn't really show on the slide, but in the real life, the real website, this is a very interactive tab. And if you click on one of these, so in this print screen, if you click on government-led measures, there are these little bubbles that appear, and it shows you which countries out of the 30 have implemented, for example, a government-led program. So in this case, it's 16 of them, yes, and 14 haven't. And then you can play along on this website and then check for all of the measures. And hovering over the bubbles, you'll see which of the countries we're talking about. So you would do the same for, you could click on criminal measures, and then it would show you, as mentioned before, which countries criminalize traveling to Syria, or which countries criminalize incitement to terrorism, and so on and so forth. As I mentioned before, we also wanted the hub to serve as, a hub or like a collection of relevant legislation. So there's a tab called Standards and Guidance where we gathered all international and regional standards and guidance and legal framework that addresses foreign terrorist fighters. So here you can find everything from relevant UN Security Council resolutions to UN General Assembly resolutions, relevant EU legislation, but also guidance from regional organizations such as NATO or ASEAN, or other documents, legally non-binding documents such as GCTF documents. And finally, as I also mentioned before, it is also a library of relevant publications. We categorized, or we try to gather all the information or all articles related to foreign terrorist fighters from the past decade. These are organized based on regions, and they're also organized based on theme. So here, for example, if you click on one of the continent little maps, it will give you a list of publications that is relevant for that region. And if you scroll down on this page, you'll see that we identified 4 main themes: women, children, response to returnees, and legal challenges. Again, clicking on these, you'll get a list of publications that is relevant for that given topic. And the little icons next to the publications, they indicate whether it's going to be a long read, an academic article, a policy brief, or a blog post. And at the end of the library, there is also a selection of books that are relevant that cover foreign terrorist fighters, and also databases such as the International Crimes Database. I think this is the Foreign Terrorist Fighters Knowledge Hub in a nutshell. As I said, it should be online, hopefully within the next couple of days. It looks way cooler when it's interactive. So do check it out, and we hope that you will find it useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Indeed, we're very much looking forward to the Knowledge Hub to go online. There's been a lot of work put into this website by ICCT and ASER, so I think that's quite a valuable resource to all researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. So stay tuned, subscribe to our newsletter, then you will know when it goes online. I think that's probably the best way to be aware of this. Without further ado, I would like to invite the panelists to move on stage. Helen Duffy, Rashmi Singh, Tom Parker. The floor is yours for this last stretch of the annual conference.
Yeah. Do I need it? Yeah. We'll do that. So let's see, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to be asked to chair this very interesting discussion, I'm sure, with our excellent speakers here today. I'll start very briefly introducing myself. My name's Helen Duffy. I'm a professor of human rights and humanitarian law across the road there at the University of Leiden, the Wijnhaven building. And most of the week, I do that part-time, most of the week I'm a human rights practitioner, so I run human rights in practice and I bring strategic human rights litigation. Much of that human rights litigation and advice does concern counter-terrorism, but not exclusively. So I look at this issue somewhat as an academic and most of the time as a practitioner. But more importantly, I should actually say that that's partly why I'm so late and rushing in a flap, is that I did have a deadline today as a practitioner. So I apologize that meant that I missed all of your discussion up to now, but from what I've heard, it was very interesting as well. So I'll introduce very briefly. We've agreed that we will do very brief introductions because we could talk all day about these people and not hear from these people. Rashmi Singh is an associate professor at the Department of International Relations at the Pontifical Catholic University of Minas Gerais. Is that how one pronounces that? In Brazil. She's associate editor of Perspectives on Terrorism, Her scholarship is really interesting, I must say, but her work mainly relates to violent groups engaged in campaigns of national independence and transnational terrorist groups. She's an area specialist with regional expertise in both the Middle East and South Asia, which I think will be particularly interesting in our discussion. Tom Parker is the author of Avoiding the Terrorist Trap, which is now #1 on my reading list. I'm not going to lie and say I've read it, but it looks amazing. So I'm on a flight to Melbourne on the weekend, so that's just enough time to read The Terrorist Trap, because apparently it's about 800 pages. I've chosen very well. My book was 1,000, which was 562 long, I decided later. But anyway, Tom is currently the project coordinator for counter-terrorism programming in the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the country office in Nigeria. Prior to that, he was chief of party of a European Union project providing assistance to the Office of the National Security Advisor in Baghdad. He's been an advisor on human rights and counterterrorism to the UN Counter-Terrorism Implementation Task Force, to NGOs such as Amnesty International, and you were for some time at the ICTY, where I believe we met very briefly a long time ago. Anyway, thank you both very much. The idea of this afternoon's discussion principally is to reflect on the impact of counterterrorism on human rights. So thinking about that interrelationship. And so I thought I would open up just by asking some very broad questions in terms of your perspective on that. Do you think that the counterterrorism agenda is less or more human rights focused today than it was 20 years ago, and why, in light of your experience? And I wonder if you could just sketch out what you would see as some of the key trends and challenges facing human rights in the counterterrorism field. And of course, we're particularly interested both in your big picture ideas, but also in the examples that you have from your work in the Global South, which is sometimes more neglected in our discussions than other aspects. Should we start with you? Thank you.
Now it's on. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. If I'm slurring, please excuse me, the jet lag is kicking in. In my perspective, I think the last 20 years have seen a slightly schizophrenic approach to counterterrorism. In terms of narrative, I think human rights is something that we are talking about a lot more. It's, you know, the norms of human rights, and if human rights are being looked after in our counterterrorism policy is something that is more and more heard, not only amongst the ivory tower of academia, but practitioners, policymakers, institutions. But in my perspective, when we start looking at the reality of counterterrorism, and especially the expanding remit of counterterrorism, and our response first in 20 years ago with the global war on terror, Operation Enduring Freedom, and as that has progressively evolved across different parts of the world, I actually think human rights are in a much, much worse position today, potentially, than they were 20 years ago. And this is coming from not only how we have behaved in terms of exporting violence as part of our kinetic counterterrorism policy to the Global South, in order to protect specific interests, but also in terms of how even domestically within Europe, within North America, how the expanding legislation has actually dealt with citizens, immigrants, and criminalized that, and sort of encroached upon what were seen as, at one point, almost fundamental rights that could never be encroached upon. So in my perspective, I think we're in a worse position today than we were in 2001, 2020. I think, why don't I pass that to you, Tom, and then I'll come back to challenges and things, because I think they're kind of interrelated.
Is there anybody in this room, please put up your hand if you are a counterterrorism investigator. Not on? Anybody in the room who's a counter-terrorist investigator? Anybody in the room who's a current intelligence analyst? One. For a government? No. So that's our problem in a nutshell. I'm not sure it's schizophrenia. I think it's two different conversations. And when I was thinking about what to say at this event, and we were looking at a UN, or at least we were looking at a global counterterrorism strategy, the reality is there's more than one global counterterrorism strategy. There's the one we talk about, and that the UN articulates, and that does definitely, one of the pillars of the UN counterterrorism strategy is human rights-based approaches, right? It's very much part of our conversation. We mainstream human rights, we mainstream gender in all of our programming. Then the other conversation is what practitioners talk about. It's the policemen, the intelligence officers, the soldiers. The one thing you didn't mention from my CV is I was an intelligence officer. I was a security service officer in the UK for 8 years. And I cannot recall a single moment, a single conversation in those 8 years where anybody used the phrase human rights. Now, there were reasons for that in the UK. The UK didn't pass the Human Rights Act, which enshrined the European Convention on Human Rights in British law until 1998, and I left in 1997. But the larger point is that the officers involved in this, they worry about national law and national instruction. They don't worry about international law. And my concern is we've never really managed to penetrate that conversation. Everybody knows what to say when they come to an international forum. When CTED turns up to do a country assessment, they know the right things to say. They're going to have pat answers about gender mainstreaming, and they're going to have pat answers about due process and all of those good things. But then when you talk to people on the margins, when you talk to people in the field, there is still this bias amongst practitioners, whether it is in the United States, whether it's in Nigeria, or whether it's in Southeast Asia, or whether it's in Europe, that coercive force is the only language that people involved in terrorism really understand. And that's the problem. And we've yet to find a way to put over the human rights, I've spent the last 20 years trying to do it, to put across the human rights language in such a way that practitioners see practical utility to embedding it in their work. And don't get me wrong, I wrote an 800-page book that argues that within the counterterrorism done within a human rights framework is more effective counterterrorism, right? Human rights totally anticipates that states will need to bug, eavesdrop, run agents, right? Interview suspects, detain suspects, and on occasion use lethal force to stop active threats. All of this is envisaged by human rights law. Broadly speaking, and I'm very nervous saying this with experts on the stage, but broadly speaking, the human rights constraints are that you have to do it lawfully, and what you do has to be necessary, it has to be proportional, and it has to be something else, and I'm blanking on it. This is why I wrote it down. I only ever get 3 out of the 4. Reasonable, necessary, and proportionate. Which begs the question, why on earth would you want to do something that wasn't reasonable, wasn't necessary, wasn't proportionate, was unlawful, right? I mean, why would you need to do that to do effective counterterrorism? And that's the conversation we've yet to put across in a way that's persuasive for a lot of practitioners around the world.
Actually add another nuance. I agree with you completely there. I think an additional nuance, and I'm speaking from personal experience, again, working with the UK government, is that there is more of a conversation regarding human rights. There's definitely the focus on counterterrorism as a kinetic coercive response, but there is more space for a conversation about human rights when it is being applied in Europe and in North America than it is in terms of what is going to be happening in Afghanistan or Somalia or Yemen. And this is coming from a direct conversation that I had in the past. The first part related to the resurgence of the IRA, and the second part regarding Afghanistan, where the conversation actually started with what was acceptable collateral damage. I mean, so there is a very clear us versus them within the determinants of counterterrorism policy as well, which is unfortunately, even today, at the global level, largely determined by the global north. And I think that is also very, very clearly seen in terms of how this plays out in different parts of the world with regards to the positionality of the European Union and others, but also in terms of how then local governments respond to that, either bandwagoning along or literally trying to use that as force multipliers for their own particular personal gains.
Can you jump on very quickly on
You
that?
can. Yeah. I'm going to follow up on that, but go ahead, respond, and I'll see if I'm still inclined.
It's been absolutely toxic to the human rights narrative has been the hypocrisy of northern countries, right? Hypocrisy is kryptonite to values. Oh my goodness sakes, really? Sorry. I just use my parade ground voice normally and bark at the back because I hate these things. No, I think this is fine if I talk into it. Of course, fair enough. So essentially I think hypocrisy has massively undermined the human rights narrative. And while the human rights narrative is not exclusively a WEOG narrative, it is often perceived as such in other parts of the world. And I went through a phase of collecting quotes from terrorist leaders that actually mentioned human rights and hypocrisy in the same sentence. And you can find quotes from al-Zawahiri, from bin Laden, and from Abu Musab al-Zarqawi talking about this. In fact, I think it's al-Zarqawi who says, who on earth believes the lie, the Western lie of human rights after Abu Ghraib, right? This has been enormously damaging. And when I have conversations now in the countries that I work in, the first thing that will come up is Guantanamo, which is, let's not forget, still open, right? And has still only prosecuted, well, mostly it's plea deals, 8 people? And yet we still haven't closed it. It's still there. It's still immensely symbolic of our hypocrisy in the West. Obviously, drone strikes is another area that we could talk about. And so this is the challenge, right? The people most associated with these values are also the people who have been seen to betray these values in the last 20 years. And I think that's destroyed the norm.
And that sort of ties into the second question that you had asked. What are the challenges? How do we overcome this? Because we are essentially, we all are able to frame, whether we are practitioners or investigators, we understand the value of human rights in counterterrorism. We realize that this is not going to be strategically effective, tactically perhaps for a short while, but strategically effective. But we are still very much mired in that kinetic response, which essentially plays into the hand of the terrorists. So we are helping recruitment, we are helping narrative, we are helping essentially perpetuate the cycle of an escalating violence, because that's essentially what we've seen in the last 20 years, escalating violence, because it is always a matter of, okay, how can we outdo the other? And therefore our response is, oh, of course, we have to use more force. And then everything else, whether it's de-radicalization or counter-narrative or anything else that we talk about in terms of the terrorist cycle, always comes as a secondary step. Our first response is always the hit out first, because the kinetic is an important part. And there's no denying that. But the problem here and the challenge here is, how do we break that cycle?
I thought you were about to tell us. Is that for the next round? We'll come back to how we do that then a little bit later.
Did I just dig my grave?
Tom, do you want to follow up on that question? Maybe trends and challenges. What big picture trends do you see, and what about the challenges?
Well, I think one trend we don't talk about enough is technology. And one thing that's changed massively in the last 20 years is 20 years ago, there wasn't even one country on earth really that had the technology to reach out and touch somebody anywhere on the planet, right? The Israelis a little bit, with Wrath of God and the aftermath to the Munich Olympics, had demonstrated a capability to kill people in various places around the world, but it wasn't a capability that many states had. Now, 60, 70 states have that capability. And that's a huge, huge change. And that's just targeted killing. We could talk about modern surveillance. Our previous speaker touched upon it. I'm not so sure that the picture's quite as hopeless for states as he represented. Quite the reverse, actually. And then if we look at things like facial recognition software and micro drones, and there is a remarkable range of tools now open to states to get very, very close to what's often referred to as the panopticon, total situational awareness. Not that far away from that. And not just the ability to surveil, but the ability to surveil against databases. That's a critical connection as well. And throw in AI and the ability to go through those databases and make connections quickly. And you can very, very seriously see how the world has changed. And not in a way that protects human rights, but in a way that makes it much easier, frankly, to avoid them. And then given that so much of what we do in counterterrorism is expeditionary, i.e. it's not done on our soil, it's done on somebody else's soil, fewer laws apply. You know, it's one thing having a conversation about policemen, it's another conversation if we're talking about the CIA or SIS or Mossad or the SVR, right? Because they work in a world where they break rules automatically. If you're an MI6 officer operating in, you know, collecting intelligence in India, you are breaking the law in India. It's that simple. And that's true of every country's intelligence service operating outside of its boundaries. So these are people, again, you know, who are often running these lethal programs in particular, but also the intelligence collection programs, who work out with law. That's the norm. That's their daily place of work. And how do you control that? How do you control the threats that leaves out of the bag?
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, I think that question of technology is interesting. Actually, I just recently did a report on counterterrorism in Africa and identifying trends, and many of the conversations, Bibi, you and I were working on this for some time. A number of the conversations, there were many different trends that were identified, but one of them was certainly technological trends and very different views on whether that was a positive or a negative for human rights. I mean, we've talked about the negative dimensions, or at least the challenges that it poses. Clearly the need to make sure that legal and policy frameworks catch up, and there are many gaps in that particular area. But also perhaps positive developments in terms of human rights defence that technology brings to the table as well. So getting that balance right as ever is I think, is interesting. Great, so trends, any other, did you have any major trends that you see in terms of, I mean, I was quite interested in how we started this talking about the conversation in a way, because you were saying we talk a lot more about human rights, and that's actually really important. I was glad that you started there. That has to mean something. I mean, at least on paper, the fact that we do have all of these references, the fact that there, you know, are so many references by many actors, even those that may or may not be taking them as seriously as they should, as you suggested, but the fact that it now is a routine part of the discourse, and of course that wasn't the case in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, it was quite the opposite. Is that significant at all, or were you suggesting, Tom, that it's really not, that it's just pro forma and therefore doesn't matter at all? Clearly there's an enforcement challenge, but it does matter, doesn't it?
No, I think it does enormously. There's one group of people who care a lot about human rights, and that's humans, right? So I've been talking about investigators, I've been talking about governments, but the vast majority of us aren't investigators and aren't representatives of governments. We're the people who they do things to. And I think the concept of human rights is now quite deeply embedded in most societies around the world. Not always interpreted necessarily quite the same way in different societies, but the concept, I think, is a universal concept in a way now that perhaps it wasn't. I'm stretching perhaps, but I think it is part of a global conversation, let's put it that way, in a way that maybe it wasn't quite so much. I don't think it's exclusively now a Western European concept. I think it is owned a bit more broadly by that than that. But, and I completely take your point that the technology does introduce an ability to have a degree of accountability. One thinks of, and is it the MH17? I'm not quite sure of the flight number, but the Dutch airliner that was shot down over Ukraine, right? And the work done by Bellingcat and people in terms of identifying the perpetrator. You know, it is possible now for human rights investigators, small I, all over the world to do open source research in such a way that you can hold people, you can put people in the frame. Whether you can hold them to account, that's a slightly more open question. But identifying perpetrators of incidents, I think, is a lot easier than it's ever been. For exactly the same reason, the technology now allows people to, you know, it's impossible, as the guys driving the book rocket launcher discovered. I mean, it's impossible to drive 300 miles in Russia. I mean, forget Western Europe, in Russia, without being recorded on multiple devices. I don't know if anybody's read the Bellingcat investigation, but there is a phenomenon in Russia of filming yourself from your dashboard cam playing music as you drive around towns. Apparently people do it a lot. Don't see the appeal myself, but people are out there doing it. And multiple people doing that recorded this rocket launcher as it slowly made its way across Russia. And because people then post these videos on YouTube and on other social media sites, it's possible to find them. And then they're geolocated. And you can use things like Google Maps and Google Street View to then identify exactly where this item was. You can match the background of the video to the maps that you can access online. And it is quite amazing. Even in North Korea, Amnesty International has been able to carry out really effective investigations into human rights abuses, mass human rights abuses, so in things like camps, using open source materials and satellites that are commercially selling them their feeds to find out something behind a very, very close frontier. So, you know, I mean, there are opportunities as well as challenges, but ultimately real accountability comes from being able to take somebody into a courtroom, and that's still very difficult for a lot of people on the planet.
I think there's too much information. Let's try this. Maybe I should have had more coffee. I think I would start with our previous point in terms of technology, because I think, yes, there's this absolute positive and negative to technology. But I also think, again, there's this difference between, you know, like you were saying, who has these abilities now in counterterrorism is expanding. But then again, we have a very clear difference in terms of global north, global south. And for global south, it's become aspirational technology, which has a very clear impact on alliances and the kinds of counterterrorism agreements and policies and aids and then other sort of, you know, global politics that this may impact in terms of policy. So I think that's one aspect that's very interesting. But also, I think it sort of goes back to this idea of schizophrenia again, because again, at one level, yes, we're talking about it a lot, but at the end of it, I wonder if it's just, you know, kowtowing to this norm and paying lip service, because in reality, when we're looking at how the global war on terror has essentially desensitized us to ever increasing encroachment into civil liberties, has desensitized. I mean, people don't even want to hear about what's going on in Yemen or Somalia. Oh, just more news, just another drone strike. You know, it's absolutely in the periphery of the general consciousness. And I think this is all kind of linked together. So, you know, you were giving an excellent example. And I think governments realize how technology is playing into this when it comes to counterterrorism. And the best example that I have is when India revoked the special status for Jammu and Kashmir. The largest democracy in the world essentially imposed an internet blackout that lasted 7 months. Now, that's not unusual. The largest democracy in the world has essentially imposed and continues to impose internet blackouts on Jammu and Kashmir. You know, you have phases. So for instance, there was a 7-month blackout for Kashmir, and that was unprecedented. When internet was reintroduced, it was, I think they gave them 2G access, which was impossible. And it had real life repercussions, whether it was, you know, during COVID pandemic, kids could not go to school, they could not do online education, all the way down to, you know, Kashmir, Jammu Kashmir, large parts of it are remote areas, mountainous areas. There are organizations, there are doctors who essentially run WhatsApp groups where they provide support services. So if there is a sheep herder in some remote area exhibiting signs that a local doctor cannot figure out, he puts it on WhatsApp, or she puts it on WhatsApp, and, you know, somebody says, oh, that's a cardiac arrest, do this, do this, do this. You know, that has real life repercussions. And internet access is a human right. It's been declared by the United Nations as a human right. So I think these are very, very clear trends that we are seeing, because on the one hand, we are seeing this very clear positionality, whether from countries in the global north or the global south, in terms of, yes, this is what we should be doing, but how that is actually being enacted in practice is steadily eroding what is normal in counterterrorism. And that has very, very deep negative repercussions on human rights. And what is the most concerning here is the fact that we are steadily desensitizing everybody, the humans as you call it, as to what is acceptable and what is negotiable.
Yeah, great.
Can I? So what? Let me offer a very depressing reason for hope, which is there is another type of schizophrenia, and I've been doing quite a lot of work recently in the United States on right-wing extremism. Conversation around right-wing extremism is a very, very different conversation than the one about Islamic extremism. It's a very rights-based conversation, right? Because now we're talking about white people. And so in the United States, suddenly there's a lot of concern about, monitoring, hate speech and infringing people's free speech rights. Could PV really be a thing for this community? It seems very intrusive. We don't want to alienate that community as well. It's so fascinating that it's a completely different conversation that the United States has been having about terrorism for 20 years. Totally different conversation, simply because it's a different community. It's us, not the other. And that at least has elevated rights back into the discussion, but it's ultimately because of racism, right? So hence this is a depressing reason for hope. But it is an example of rights being brought back, rights that essentially have been ignored, bartered away for security, suddenly are very much part of a conversation again, in a way that they weren't for the last 20 years. So I don't know, that's one of those other schizophrenic things that maybe is a little hopeful in some kind of ways.
I think, I think again, there's the global south, global north, because so if we look at Brazil, for example, you could actually have that conversation in Brazil with a little bit of the racial element brought in, as well as, of course, the fact that there is this very clear evangelist perspective there. But if you're looking at the right wing in India, that goes into, I think, an even more depressing scenario, because then you're linking it to the rightful population that belongs there, to the true nation, and the even, I would say, intensification of the Islamophobia that we have seen in the last 20 years. So I think, that glimmer of hope, and I think you're absolutely right. I think that is a glimmer of hope, but it's geographically focused.
Yeah, I was struggling to see it as terribly hopeful anyway, but I think it is important to be reminded of of how much inequality is so at the base of and intertwined with so many of the different human rights violations that we could talk about in counterterrorism. Moving on to a different question, and we'll come back to all these themes, which I think are fascinating. I understand that one of the themes that's come up a bit in your discussions in the past couple of days is about, in a sense, we're seeing a deprioritization, perhaps a de-emphasis on counterterrorism in some contexts. On the other hand, we could say that in the past 20 years, we've seen such an enormous emphasis on counterterrorism on the international level and nationally around the globe. So I'm wondering if this is a moment for reflection, in a sense. Has the extent of the emphasis at UN level, regionally, nationally, has the extent of that emphasis on counterterrorism as such, or the war on terror, but counterterrorism as such, been bad for human rights, good for human rights? Do we need to shift that emphasis and that framing? Thoughts? Who would like to go first?
I think we should have had this reflection a while ago. Okay, first of all, I think anybody who works on terrorism, counterterrorism, would have been surprised by the overwhelming focus that terrorism has had in security policy over the last 20 years. And the fact, yes, there has been a problem. Yes, there has been a transnational threat, but it has never been the existential threat that it was made out to be. And I think that is where we are deeply flawed in our approach to counterterrorism, or have been deeply flawed in our approach to counterterrorism over the last 20 years. We had a workshop earlier today that was fascinating, talking about transnationalism and right-wing terrorism. And I was, fascinated by the overlaps with the discussion that was happening there in terms of how increasingly far-right extremism, far-right terrorism is being framed in the same manner as we framed Islamist terrorism 20 years ago. And, people who were working with governments, we went hoarse trying to explain that Al-Qaeda is not the same thing as Taliban, is not the same thing as Hamas. And it took governments, 8 years to figure that out, and then it was already too late. And I think there is a danger that we are going to recreate another boogeyman and have this very, very overwhelming response. It might be a little bit more gentle because the boogeyman is a little bit closer to home this time, perhaps. But I do think, although there has been a little bit of de-escalation in terms of the focus on counterterrorism, it's not gone away. And I think there's two reasons for that. And I think I'm going to say this and I'll let it go because I can bang on about this. I think, first of all, the only reason we are not completely and absolutely focused in on CT right now is because of Russia and Ukraine. I think, great power politics has come back into the play in a very, very big manner over the last 2 years or so. And I think that is sort of taking the focus away back to traditional security in a way that we haven't seen in 20 years. However, given the fact that we are seeing Russia and increasingly other countries using, we've had this discussion, militias, private military companies, as force multipliers in different spaces, is going to bring that CT conversation back on the table, possibly in new ways that are going to revisit the challenges that we have not yet resolved.
So I guess I have two things that I would reflect on. I mean, the first is I'm a huge believer in Jerry Pournelle's iron law of bureaucracy, which is essentially that once you create something, it's very, very hard to get rid of it. So I don't think counterterrorism is going anywhere. I think existing institutions have a tremendous amount of inertia. I think that's what the special rapporteur was warning about in her most recent report to General Assembly. I highly recommend you read that. It's very, very interesting about the security industrial complex and the weight and the power that has. And that's not going anywhere, and it will fight to protect its turf. So I think that's one point. The second is, I'm going to be cheeky and say that actually I do think terrorism was an existential threat. The problem is the terrorists weren't the people posing the existential threat, right? The call was coming from inside the house. The existential threat that terrorism poses is the way we react in our perceptions to that threat. And as an American, which you may not all get from my accent, it's very clear to see the society we've inherited 20 years later because of decisions that were made 2 administrations ago, right? The actions that were taken by the Bush administration have had consequences, and they have changed the country. And that is the very definition of an existential threat, to the point that we have an election going on and we're worried what's going to happen. That was inconceivable 20 years ago, that one of our 2 main parties may not recognize the result of an election. It still astounds me. And that is, as I say, that's an existential threat to an American democracy right there. But it came from a way of looking at the world and a way of advocating for a certain response to threats.
So is the existential threat coming from terrorism or counterterrorism?
Yeah, I think clearly the argument here is it's coming from counterterrorism, if it's done badly, because I'm not against counterterrorism if it's done well. I think you actually have a human rights obligation to do counterterrorism well, right? You have an obligation as a state to ensure the full rights enjoyment of your citizens, rights that, again, as the counterterrorism coordinator pointed out, terrorists are trying to deprive them of. So counterterrorism isn't merely a necessary thing, it is actually a human rights obligation. But it has to be done, again, within those 4 pillars: lawfulness, necessity, proportionality, and I'm going to forget the 4th one again. Reasonableness. Thank you. We need an acronym. That's what we need. Just need an acronym for that. There is one, but it doesn't use those 4 words. I came across it. The Americans have an acronym for it, but they don't use reasonableness. They use something else. So it hasn't helped me solve the problem.
No, I don't think anybody is arguing against the fact that, we need counterterrorism. Obviously we do. But I think the challenge is, how do we actually do good counterterrorism without falling into interest groups and stakeholders and power politics and the rest that comes with it? And I think that is the perpetual and everlasting challenge of counterterrorism.
Choose, right? One guy almost 20 years ago tried to get on a plane once with a bomb hidden in his shoe that didn't work. And I will go to an airport tomorrow and I will take my shoes off 3 times on my way home, right? That is this inertia, this sort of unbelievable ability that counterterrorism measures have to embed and not go away, because nobody wants to take that decision, right? Nobody's going to slash the counterterrorism budget by 50%. The other metaphor we used to use a lot in the UK was the ring of steel around the city of London, which took about 20 years to slowly fade away. First, they took the armed police off it, and then they took some of the cones away, and then they took some more of the cones away, and then they took away the little barriers with the water. But I mean, it took about 20 years for all traces of those things to go away, because nobody wanted to make the final decision, because there's such a political consequence if something happens, if you own that nobody wants to take that risk. And I think that's a huge challenge for us. The other thing I'm really struck by is when I was a security service officer in the 1990s, MI5 had 200 officers. And that was in the height of the mainland bombing campaign that the provisional IRA was mounting. Now the service is somewhere around, I think, 4,000 or 5,000 service personnel. And that is an enormous increase in size, and it will not shrink. I mean, that I can promise you. So that is, I think, a challenge, right? If you've got 5,000 people, they have to do something. Right? That's the other thing. They can't all just sit around saying, well, we've solved this, right? They will look for new threats. I was in the security service after the Cold War ended and after the Northern Ireland peace process. So what did we do? We got involved in organized crime for all of 2 years, and then Al-Qaeda came along and we got out of organized crime and went straight back into counterterrorism. So that's the challenge as well, right? Is once you've got these organizations working, they will find work to do. It's production for use.
Okay, one of your comments actually segues quite well into the next question, which I thought fitted very well with the general theme of this conversation. And it's the link that you see between the rise of authoritarian regimes and terrorism or counter-terrorism. I was interested in asking for your views on this, partly because I was really struck when I was listening to one of the final speeches of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Bachelet, and she was talking, of course, as many people are, about the crisis facing democracy. And I was really struck by when she highlighted the various elements or the indicators of this crisis facing democracy at the moment around the globe. She talked about the fact that we're back at 1989 levels of democracy, that a third of the world's population living under authoritarian rule, more states looking towards in that direction than towards democracy. And she had a bunch of indicators of that democratic demise, which included attacks on political opposition, attacks on constitutional courts, on the media, on human rights institutions, fading trust in public institutions, people feeling marginalized, inequality, lack of transparency, secrecy, lack of accountability, and undermining of our shared humanity. And what struck me in that speech about democracy was that it was almost exactly the same as the index to my counterterrorism report in terms of the threats that arise from counterterrorism, as they were described to me by many different interlocutors in the African context. So it just made me question, to what extent what is that link and that relationship? To what extent has the way that counterterrorism unfolded in the past 20 years perhaps paved the way to some of what we're seeing in terms of these challenges of democracy? How do you see that, that relationship, if any?
Well, I think it's the undermining of norms, right? I mean, to have, there's a great quote from Donald Trump from the last election where he's asked about waterboarding. And he says, well, we should absolutely waterboard terrorists because it works. And if it doesn't work, they deserve it, right? Can you imagine that as a policy statement 10 years before that? No. And that conversation has coarsened because of the actions taken. It's possible to say things like that when people have seen pictures of Abu Ghraib and had to choose a side. Our brave soldiers versus doing the right thing. Conversation when I was at Amnesty, I used to have all the time with Americans, right? At the end of the day, most people in the United States are incredibly supportive of the armed forces. You're all familiar of the abuse in Abu Ghraib, right? The 2 people who went to jail, Lindy England, Grainer, I think was the name of the master sergeant. They still live in the town. It was a local National Guard unit. They live in that town. The guy who blew the whistle had to leave, right? The person that reported the torture that put an end to a torture, that guy can't live there anymore. The torturers, welcome back into the community. And this is the compromises we make so that, you know, it's my side right or wrong, have tremendous impact on sort of established values. I always think that particularly there's a particular vulnerability in the United States. This is pop psychology. I'm treat it for all the value it's worth, which is nothing. But one of the things that I think is interesting about Europe is Europe lost its innocence in World War I. Right? There's the famous line from, I don't know, is it Wilfred Owen, never such innocence again, right? Because we threw thousands of young men into a charnel house, patriotism never quite was the same again. And America didn't really have that experience. Yes, they were on the Western Front, and yes, they joined late, but America never had that falling out of patriotism. A little bit maybe during Vietnam, but it's a little different. You know, we have an expression in England, and you'll see my schizophrenia, I'm half English, half American. I go backwards and forwards. In England, we talk about patriotism being the last refuge of the scoundrel, right? There is no equivalent for that phrase in the United States. Quite the reverse. I mean, just think of Donald Trump kissing the flag, that photograph that's often does the rounds. Right? That isn't seen as an ironic gesture, right? That is seen as a sincere gesture. It's taken for exactly the performative thing that it is, a love of country. And I think that's really difficult. If you have to choose between your country and your values, and you choose your country, you're in big problems. And I think that's one of the things that's happened in a lot of countries, but not all countries after 9/11. I think that's what's happened in the United States. And the United States is critical, right? Because they were the biggest voice. I don't think we can really underestimate the damage that having the United States be part of the country letting the side down has had to the cause of human rights, when it had traditionally been seen as the arsenal of democracy, the champion. That I think is a huge change. And I don't know how you repair that, right? You know, it's not a Republican Democrat thing. Obama carried out more drone strikes than Trump did, right? So, you know, it's deeper than that. Somehow the United States has to, or at least the European Union maybe, could play that role, but I'm not sure that it can. I think it perhaps needs to be the United States, and I don't see the United States stepping up and playing that role anymore.
I think that's very, very true, because I think, you know, essentially, especially after first because of the end of the Cold War and sort of the moral victory along with everything else that entailed for the United States, and the very exceptionalist way that the United States framed itself within international politics in terms of not only its duties but also its rights, is something that was looked upon as something, you know, it was a leadership role. It was something aspirational, and it was also very clearly defining the parameters of behavior. So even those states that were not quite towing the line were not openly, at least, flaunting the line quite as much as they are today. But I think it's exactly like you said, because we see what was once the sole superpower going down this very, very dark path. We see, first of all, other states bandwagoning on that policy, and that behavior, with varying repercussions. But I'd also think that what we are seeing, I mean, you know, for example, you're talking about the United States. When I look at India, for example, now India is a very, very interesting case. And it always surprises me that more people do not study India when we talk about terrorism, because India has literally got every version of terrorism that might exist in the world. And one of the things that we have seen within India, thanks to the colonial past, thanks to the independence movement, thanks to this very clear positioning in the international system, it has got this very clearly patriotic, nationalistic sense of identity. And what has happened with these ever-present threats, we've seen particular political groups and stakeholders being able to operationalize and weaponize insecurities and fears that were already present with very real faces. There was a reality of that there, but hinge that to their own very particular political motivations, objectives, and ideologies, giving more and more space to an authoritarian, right-wing specifically, outlook in terms of what should be India's identity, but also in that process steadily eroding what is acceptable behavior against those that are considered others, whether those are external others or internal others. And I think that is one of the greatest threats that we're seeing. And I frankly believe that this is happening in various forms in different parts of the world, where there are traditional insecurities that are being grafted on and weaponized by regimes and groups and individuals that are using them and using these insecurities to achieve particular strategic objectives. And so absolutely, and I think it's not just one thing, it's multi-causal, but it's all sort of feeding in. And now that we're 20 years down the line from 2001, we're actually really seeing that take form in a way that perhaps, you know, it needed this time to percolate.
I would love to see a really good book about the history of terrorism in India.
I'm working
there
on it.
is so much, but you can go back to the 19th century, the connection between Irish nationalists and Indian nationalists. There's a court case in is it San Francisco in maybe 1914. I mean, it's a rich, deep, interesting history, and very much part of the. Is it Bagram Singh who the Modi now is a huge fan of, and it is Bhagat Singh. Thank you. You know, it's really fascinating because it's a real modern thing, and also there's just so many interesting examples, you know, like the Amritsar massacre, for example, where you can see how bad counterterrorism has actually exacerbated the situation. Who's the guy who kills
Dyer?
Yeah, well, the other one, O'Dwyer, in fact.
Oh, now you're going to put me on a spot. Azad.
Yes. So there's somebody who is alleged to have survived the massacre, although there's a very good book by Anant Singh, is it, that actually can't place him at the scene, but he dedicates 20 years of his life traveling all around the world to tracking down and killing the people responsible, which he finally does during the Second World War, in the East End of London, manages to kill the guy who was the governor at the time.
And closely linked to the IRA. In doing
right,
that.
Yeah, and uses a name that is deliberately chosen, a nom de guerre that is deliberately chosen because one name's Muslim, I think one name's is Hindu, and then the other maybe Freedom or something like that.
Azad.
So, Azad, right? So it's deliberately chosen to, you know, propaganda by deed to send a message of unity, and it's fascinating. So I'd love to see that book. So put me down for the first copy.
You'd be interested to know that I had a very interesting conversation with somebody from the IRA once who told me that do you know the Irish should actually take credit for the Indian independence movement. And I was just, seriously, huh? Because evidently the first song of national liberation was Wearing the Old Green, because it was evidently an Irishman who was standing when the marchers went by, and they didn't have a song, so he sort of joined the march and started singing, and everybody learned that Wearing the Old Green.
There's strong connections, and you see it actually in the history of Irish independence, explicit referencing between the Indian national movement and what's the Irish Republican movement to texts and personalities and miscarriages of justice. It's really, really interesting. And also there's a link with Narodnaya Volya and Russian anarchists as well. Because Bhagat Singh is an anarchist, if I remember rightly.
He's left wing, and he's linked in from the whole INS side.
Right. So yeah, really,
I'm
really
going to have to intervene now because this is, I can tell.
Sorry,
we're
nerding out. We're nerding out on the stage. This is bad.
Not at all. I think it's extremely interesting, but you know, I don't want to ruin your book. We don't want to hear about all of it, right? You have to get it done, and we have to buy it, and we'll hear more about it then. But it's fascinating. Thank you. I wanted to maybe ask. I have about another 10 questions, but you're far too good at the answers, so I'm not going to get to those questions. And I think we need to wrap up quite soon. Do I have time maybe for another question before we move to the? Exactly. I want to open the floor to questions. So maybe we'll do that. And if none of you have any questions, then I will proceed to ask another one. But let's open up for questions at this point, please. So that's why you stopped me asking my question, Tanya, so you could ask your question. Please go ahead. Absolutely.
Zoom out a little bit. I mean, I'm obviously also fascinated with what's happening in India and following it as well. But I do think if we zoom out and we see this single identity, which is, we see it in other countries, Sri Lanka, Singapore, and Israel, and then combining it with this backsliding of democracy. I mean, it's not only in Poland and Hungary, in the US. So how can we weaponize against it? I mean, are there ways that we can strengthen the democracy? Or I'm curious to hear, you know, what can we do against it? Because we are seeing it in several countries, and there are indeed links with authorism and, I mean, creating space for violent extremism. Yeah, curious to hear, what can we do about it?
Okay, I'll take a shot at that. I think there's, for me, there's two things that are tremendously, or perhaps three things that are tremendously important. The first one is, and Israel comes to mind, because one of the things that, you know, we have this very particular image when we have conversations, especially about human rights and counterterrorism. We have a very particular perspective of Israel, and I think using the example of Israel, it's important to remember that countries are not homogenous. And I think we need to be able to first consistently remember that, weaponize that, and try to actually empower the central, the more liberal groups that are often sidelined in countries that are becoming increasingly authoritarian. And I think there is a very, very important role to be played by civil society and international civil society organizations. And I say civil society much more so than groups like the, you know, or institutions like the United Nations, or even groups like, you know, more well-established groups like Amnesty International, because one of the standard, you know, strategies out of the authoritarian playbook is the moment you have a statement made against an authoritarian government, it's anti-national because it's coming from this particular organization. So I think there is something to be said for having more diverse civil society organizations across the world being involved, perhaps low profile civil society organizations being more involved, and sort of liaising more with local players. And I also think it's extraordinarily important to give voice to individuals from civil society organizations and groups within the country. I think a lot of the times when we are looking at authoritarian states and how we should, you know, respond to the lack of democracy, we end up focusing on the perspective from the outside and what is important for the European Union or the United Nations. And I think it's important to remember what is actually important first and foremost is the perspective of the people inside and on the ground. And we have to find ways to actually empower that and give that more space, and be able to take those concerns and those priorities as our guidelines from the outside, instead of doing it the other way around.
Can I just very quickly add something before turning to you? I mean, one of the things we didn't get to is, of course, the extent to which expanding definitions of terrorism, of extremism, of separatism, of justification for all of the above, these counter-terrorism laws and the way they're defined, and increasingly expansive definitions. So this is a trend, I think, that is going in very much the wrong direction, even though we're seeing the really insidious implications of that, in particular for these civil society groups. Because I completely agree with what you said in terms of that being obviously a key element in bolstering democracy and countering some of these trends. But until we deal with the fact that we have these incredibly expansive and growing anti-terror laws that are being used against civil society groups and against human rights defenders. And I have to say, in my own practice, I have several human rights defenders, lawyers, judges, and others who've been accused of anti-terrorism under increasingly expansive laws. So I really have created a monster there, and it's very much linked to the question on responding to democratic threats. Can we take another question from the floor, please?
We have somebody online. We're just going to try again. We didn't successfully get voices from the ether yesterday, but we're going to give it a go right now and see if we can ask some of our audience. That's I see a head shake. So Finn, I know you can hear me. We will ask your question directly here. There's a question specifically thinking about disengagement, de-radicalization, and what Finn from the University of Exeter describes as resocialization. Is this kind of work the area where practitioners in particular can use human rights approaches and can introduce human rights most effectively in CT and PCVE? The mention is here looking at the Aarhus model of Denmark and other sort of more holistic approaches, I suppose. There's a follow-on question, but I think maybe we can start with that. Is that practitioner space the right place to be, and maybe the most effective place to be introducing these human rights considerations?
Yes is the short answer, but I wouldn't have used the example he used actually. So I think yes, you know my 20 years experience of working with people to try and promote human rights within the with practitioners is the thing that gets their attention is when you can talk about case studies where abusing human rights made the situation worse or where following human rights actually ended up in a good result. And there are many examples of that. There really are. So that is a useful that is a useful conversation, and that is one of the ways that you can really register. I'll give you an example that we've used quite a lot is bringing people who are involved in the Breivik investigation to talk about human rights compliant interviewing, because you turn up with a Norwegian policeman who's come to talk about human rights and everybody rolls their eyes, right? Of course, the Norwegians have human rights, but then he talks about what Breivik did. And he talks about the bombing of the cabinet office, and he talks about the deliberate, single-minded, individual murder of child after child after child, and the room goes quiet. And then they start to talk about the interview. And then they talk about how Breivik talked, and then led them through the crime scene. It becomes a very powerful way. The reality is, I think actually, Noreen, I think it's Ali Soufan has the line about whether somebody speaks or not has very little to do with the interviewer, right? It doesn't matter whether you torture. There's millions of examples of people who've been tortured and didn't speak. Khaled Sheikh Mohammed's a good example. Was perfectly capable of lying about the identity of bin Laden's courier when waterboarded, right? So torture is not a magic bullet. Sometimes it might work. Somebody might tell you the truth. Sometimes it may not. The one thing you can guarantee if you torture somebody is you end up a torturer and you've just committed an international crime, and you can be prosecuted for it for your dying day. But what you can't guarantee is you're going to get an answer that helps you solve anything, right? And those kind of conversations, I think, resonate. But when we start talking about PVE and human rights, and I am 100% sympathetic, and if you read my book, I talk about Aarhus, and I'm pretty uncritical. But in the last 2 or 3 years, to be honest, I've become quite critical about PVE, and particularly looking at the PREVENT program in the UK. And it's very hard. I mean, it was obviously conceived. PVE was conceived as a human rights sensitive, community sensitive approach that would take kinetic action out of it and would preempt even perhaps criminal intervention, just keep it on the social level. And what we ended up doing ultimately was securitizing social spaces, right? And teachers, medical professionals, and so forth. In the UK, one of the stats that really shocked me recently was looking at the number of children under the age of 14 who have been referred to the Channel program. Now, I'm not aware in 150 years of a single terrorist attack in the UK involving a witting 14-year-old, right? It's just not a thing. It's not a thing. So why are we referring small children to a securitized space to be deprogrammed? I mean, it's ridiculous. There are children as young as 4 years old that have been referred to the Channel program. So the problem is, however you try and intervene, if you're intervening for counter-terrorism reasons, you're going to end up securitizing that space, because there is a logic, better safe than sorry, that is going to be part of the conversation when you're doing counter-terrorism, because you're not ultimately worrying about the child, you're worrying about society. The child's interest comes second. And we've tried to, in the UK, gloss over that by using the language of protection, because they're minors. This is how insidious it gets. We're doing it for their benefit. We're protecting them, right? But we're still sending a 4-year-old off to be poked and prodded by, social workers and psychologists. And, what are they going to do when they come back to the school? The family's going to be stigmatized. I mean, these things have cast a tremendous shadow over a family, over a community. And we have no metric that can, we were discussing this yesterday, we have no metric that can prove it works, even in 1 or 2 cases, because you can't prove the negative, right? So how do you know that your intervention with the 4-year-old made a difference on that kid's trajectory? I would argue the overwhelming likelihood is, and I think there are 12, I'm going to get the number wrong, but there is a significant number of cases of people who have carried out terrorist attacks in the last 5 years in England who have been prevent referrals, right? So we definitely know it doesn't always work. That's the one stat we definitely have. And of course, you can't prove the negative. You can't prove the people who didn't carry out the terrorist attack because they went through the program. So we've spent a fortune on this. We've created a legal obligation in the UK, right? The prevent duty for every teacher. Well, if you're a teacher, what is your bias going to be, right? I take action and then I'm protected, or I don't take action and maybe somebody will come after me because I didn't fulfill my prevent duty. You create a bias for action, and that's a real problem. So I'm not convinced that PVE has turned out to be what we all hoped it was going to be, which was a softer way of responding to potential threats before they emerged. It hasn't, I think, turned out to be that. Despite the best of intentions. But long story short, yeah, I think being able to, if you could persuade practitioners with concrete examples that are compelling to them, that a human rights-based approach is more effective. I like one of the ways when I do coercive interrogation and talk about that, very simple thought experiment, right? All coercive interrogations are directed by the interrogator, right? They have to be, because you have all the agency. So if you don't know everything going into the room, there's no way for new information to come forward, right? You're going to go in and you're going to be asking closed questions. Journalists in the rooms will know the difference between an open and a closed question, right? In a coercive environment, it's not discursive. It's where's John? Tell me where John is. Where's John? If you've got the wrong name, there's no ability to correct on that, right? If you start smacking the guy in the face, yelling, where's John? He's not going to say, it's really funny, smack. You keep asking me about John, smack. You should really ask me, smack, about Peter, right? That just isn't going to happen. There's no space for that to happen. Have that conversation with somebody about how to conduct an effective interview and get the best information out of it. Then they understand that. They can understand the logic of that. They can understand the value of rapport building because it creates space. Doesn't work every time either. But when it works better than coercive interviewing. It just leads to better outcomes. And then you can start to have a conversation where people will think about it. And now I've been doing this 20 years. I reckon if I reach 30% of the people in the room, I've had a really, really good day. So I'm not going to oversell this. There's a lot about doing counterterrorism badly that makes intuitive sense to a lot of people, right? That's the problem. And then throw in revenge and anger and that they deserve it anyway thing on top. And then there's a lot of things pushing bad CT. And it's hard to push back against it. But you've got to hope that reason and good information ultimately will gain traction, because that's frankly the only weapon. I don't like using the term weapon, but it's really the only tool we've got to try and change that conversation.
Okay, I think, do you mind if we take 1 or 2 more questions, and then if you want to come back on that one, you can afterwards, because I think we only have a few more minutes. Other questions from the floor? Vivi.
Thank you to both speakers. Well, before I forget, Tom, I think an acronym can be LAMP. It's legality, I would say adequacy, actually, proportionality, necessity. So now you can remember. I was fascinating on how you started on how the effectiveness of human rights lawyers and in their inability to get the message across, and how we keep having the same conversations and it somehow never sinks in, and also because there is no conversation with that different security crowd. And as more than a decade ago, almost 2 decades ago, I was a very young member of the Peace and Security Committee of the Advisory Council on International Affairs here in the Netherlands. And I was sitting in a room with former generals, former ministers, former ambassadors, former, hotshots. And I was like younger, a lady and a lawyer. And so it was 0 to 3. I was behind in my conversation when I wanted to bring up international law limitations or human rights. And I quickly learned that the only way to really engage in a conversation, if you not use the legal argument, but rather the effectiveness of the measure. And so I think one of my hobby horses nowadays is really monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And so impact assessments is, I think, the way forward. And this has been overlooked by policymakers, by practitioners, by the whole sector, I might say. So I think if I can make a suggestion also to all the human rights lawyers in the crowd, is to also change the narrative a little bit and use the effectiveness as a way forward in steering the conversation.
Can we come back on that very quickly?
Yep.
So as a former Amnesty policy director, the problem is human rights people don't want to make that argument, right? They want to make a law-based argument or a moral argument, because the problem with making the efficacy argument is if you can prove that actually it is quite efficient to kill people, you've lost the whole match, right? Now, I completely agree with you. I wrote a book because nobody in the human rights community would make that argument, and I felt it was the only one that would land. But I also do understand why human rights people don't want to make that argument, because you're giving that tremendous hostage to fortune if you say that efficacy is the rule break, right? And that's the concern within the human rights community. But I completely agree with you, because it has been my experience that the only thing that the practitioners will listen to is efficacy. The problem is that the people who would typically promote human rights do not, I think, sound... I can't think of the appropriate academic word, but for sound doctrinal reasons, right? They don't want to make that argument, and I think that's unfortunate. But because the efficacy argument does, I think, work and is supportive and stands up to considerable examination. But I also understand why people don't want to make that argument in the human rights community.
Can I just say, just adding to that, on the same side, not the human rights side, but the counterterrorism side, Alex and I wrote this, 15 years ago? Counterterrorism doesn't know what efficacy is. We had this whole paper that we wrote on metrics of success and failure. We don't have them. So it sounds great in theory, but how do you put it into practice? Because there's no conversation.
Another thing I would say is in that brief-lived period when everybody believed in strategic communication, one of the things that was very important in strategic communication was the messenger, right? And you said it exactly, right? If I want to get a room full of military people to listen, I'll bring somebody who got a medal in the special forces, right? They'll listen to that person. Now, this may be wrong on many, many levels, but if you want to get their attention, you put an avatar of what they most respect in front of them to tell them, right? Now, this is gamesmanship, and it's not winning an argument. It's fighting dirty a little bit, but that's my experience, right? I mean, bringing a Green Beret to talk about how working with communities, in I don't know, the Hindu Kush or whatever is, and building trust and how you actually get people on your side if such a person exists, right? That's the guy you bring in to make that argument. The problem with bringing in the young lawyer is that everybody's switched off before they say anything. And again, it's not fair, it's not right, but it is the world as it is. And I don't know how you solve that. I mean, it's just, you're going to be dealing with fairly macho idiots is the reality of it. So you have to find ways to penetrate that. I'm using very masculine terms, and that seems appropriate.
Moving quickly on. I just wanted to say, actually, as someone who's been in the human rights community in various different contexts, but I think it's something of an exaggeration to say that conversation isn't happening anyway. I think there's been an awful lot of focus actually on effectiveness. And I think the legal conversation and the effectiveness conversation go together, because in order to work out, of course, what's permissible in law, you have to know what's going to be effective. You can't restrict rights unless there's an evidence-based basis for that, right? So I think the conversations run together, but I think it's also sometimes about acknowledging the limits of the conversation about effectiveness, which is super important. But of course, there's a limit to what you can measure. There's a limit to what you can prove. There's a limit to the data that we have. There's maybe a limit to the data that's been collected, and we should deal with that. Another limit is that, of course, certain things are wrong. We can call that morally wrong, we can call it legally wrong, and usually they go together, and they're also ineffective. But the fact that they were effective, you're right, that wouldn't necessarily change the rules governing torture. It wouldn't, I think, shouldn't change our approach to torture if torture worked. So there are limits to the effectiveness conversation, but it doesn't mean that it's not an important conversation that can sit alongside the legal one. I think we have to be careful not to stop talking about human rights and about law as well, because as you said earlier, there has been a normative shift too. There's been a normalization of violations, I think, and we do need to reassert the relevance of those things alongside effectiveness and others. Sorry, couldn't stop myself there. I think I've now talked myself over time. Are people desperate to ask one last question, or are you willing to do so? Am I right in saying there's a drink, or am I just hallucinating? There is a drink. Is it just that I need a drink, or that by this time I always drink? It's not that, obviously. But
the human right?
Human right, maybe. So if you don't mind, I think what we'll do is we'll continue. I mean, this has been an incredibly fruitful and interesting and provocative discussion. I think I'm sure all of you will have comments, questions and things. You've given us lots to agree and disagree with. Thank you so much for wonderful contributions. Thank you all.
All right. So we had a very rich conversation over the past 2 days, and obviously also still just now. And I won't try to summarize it all because obviously everyone's super tired and I don't have the talent to do that anyway. But I wanted to take the last opportunity to thank our keynote speakers, Ilke Salmi and Mina Noor, all the panelists, Tom, Helen Duffy, Rashmi Singh, yesterday's panelist as well, Noreen Fink, Mark Hecker, and everyone here also in the room that participated to the various workshops, the speakers to the workshops, and everyone who attended and participated to this conference. Everyone has shared great insights and thoughts on the conference theme, global power politics, counterterrorism, and human rights. I think this theme is not going to go away anytime soon. This is going to continue to color a lot of our respective works, whether we are researchers, whether we are policymakers or practitioners. This is certainly something, a strategic competition that is here to stay and to influence the work that we're doing, and counterterrorism inevitably will have to adapt. We here at ICCT, we certainly will continue to work on this topic. There will be a podcast coming out soon together with the new website of ICCT that will focus specifically on this theme and many more exciting things. So please stay tuned with ICCT's activity, register or subscribe to our newsletter to stay in touch with our activities. I also wanted to thank everyone here in the audience, here in The Hague or online. We hope that you enjoyed the talk. Please fill the online survey. Yes, I see the QR code. Hopefully you see it on your screen as well. Your feedback is very important to us. We talked about impact and evaluation. So this is part of it. So please fill this survey. And finally, I wanted to thank the entire team at ICCT for all the work that has been accomplished. This year, ICCT wouldn't be what it is without all of you. So this conference wouldn't be possible without all of you. So please thank to all the team, thank everyone, and I look forward to next year. Thank you very much.